The man in the suit, a shimmering construction of Italian silk that likely cost more than her car, smiled a predator's smile. Silas Croft didn't just wear confidence, he radiated it like a heat haze, distorting the very air around him. "And here," he said, his voice a low, cultured purr that slid over the opulent silence of the private dining room, "is the final piece of provenance, the cartouche inscription." He gestured with a manicured finger towards a flourish of Arabic script in the corner of the ancient map spread across the mahogany table. "Li Sultan al-Bahar al-Ghazi, for the Sultan of the Sea, the Conqueror, a direct dedication to the legendary Admiral himself." He was lying. In the corner of the room, standing by a marble credenza, a waitress named Elara Vance felt a familiar, sickening cold seep into her bones. It was the same cold she'd felt a decade ago in her grandfather's dusty study, the day his life's work turned to ash. She was polishing a wine glass, a meaningless, repetitive motion, but her knuckles were white. Her gaze was fixed on the man poised to sign away a fortune, Julian Thorne. He was a titan of industry, a man whose net worth was discussed in the same tones as the national debt of a small country. He reached for the sleek, gold-tipped stylus to authorize the initial wire transfer on a secure tablet. The room, Ethelgard's vaunted Elysian suite, was a vault of hushed wealth. The security was invisible but absolute. Two of Thorne's men, built like classical statues, stood impassively by the doors. Her manager, Mr. Davies, a man whose posture suggested his spine had been replaced with a yardstick, had been crystal clear. "You are atmosphere, Miss Vance. You are a functioning part of the decor. The guests are to be aware of your service, but not your presence. You do not speak. You do not react. You do not exist." But Elara knew a secret. She knew Silas Croft was a liar because the ancient Arabic script he'd just translated wasn't a dedication. It wasn't even the right dialect for a 16th century Ottoman admiral. It was a common merchant's blessing from a 19th century Levantine trading post. It was gibberish in this context. She had 1 second, 1 heartbeat to choose between her dead-end job, the roof over her head, and a truth that had already destroyed 1 generation of her family. Ethelgard's wasn't a restaurant. It was a testament to obscene wealth. It occupied the top 2 floors of a skyscraper that pierced the New York City skyline like a shard of obsidian. To dine there was to leave the mundane world behind. The air was filtered, scented with something subtle and expensive, white orchids and old leather. The carpets were so thick they swallowed sound, turning footsteps into whispers. Elara Vance breathed this rarefied air for 12 hours a day, but it never clung to her. The moment her shift ended, and she pushed through the stainless steel service doors at the back, the illusion shattered. The delicate scent was instantly bulldozed by the city's raw perfume of steamed nuts, damp pavement, and the eternal sigh of bus brakes. She was a waitress, not a culinary liaison or a service professional, as the Ethelgard's handbook preferred. She poured water that cost more per bottle than her weekly groceries, described dishes whose ingredients she couldn't afford, and cleared away plates that held more discarded food than she sometimes ate in a day. The job was an exercise in self-erasure. She was a pair of hands, a ghost in a perfectly starched black uniform, expected to anticipate a billionaire's desire for more Pellegrino from across a cavernous room, but to never, ever have a thought of her own. Mr. Davies had made the rules brutally simple on her first day. The clientele here do not wish to be reminded that the people serving them are, in fact, people. You are scenery, Miss Vance, placid, efficient, and silent. Is that understood? Elara understood. She understood the leaden weight of the mortgage on her small family home, a legacy of her grandfather's final, desperate years. She understood the faded rejection letters from academic grants that were piled in a box under her bed. She understood that this job, this daily pantomime of silent servitude, was the only thing keeping that house from the bank's clutches. So she had nodded, tied her hair into a severe bun, and learned to become invisible. Her passion, the field that had once been the entire world to her, was now a source of constant, bitter irony. She had been on the verge of completing her doctorate at Columbia, specializing in historical cartography and the linguistics of the Silk Road and maritime trade routes. She could identify the specific vellum preparation techniques of the Venetian school versus the Genoese. She could date a manuscript by the chemical composition of its iron gall ink. She had a mind brimming with priceless arcane knowledge, and she was using it to remember that the gentleman at table 7 was allergic to shellfish and preferred his martini with a single, hand-carved ice cube. In her locker, tucked away in a worn canvas bag, was her grandfather's last gift to her, a battered copy of the Kitab al-Fawaid, the legendary navigation manual by the 15th century Arab navigator, Ahmad ibn Majid. Its pages were soft as cloth, filled with his spidery, desperate annotations. It was a relic of a life spent in pursuit of historical truth, and a reminder of how easily that truth could be poisoned by a lie. The evening of the private booking in the Elysian suite had begun with a low hum of controlled chaos. The entire wing had been reserved. Julian Thorne's security team had arrived hours earlier, sweeping the rooms with devices that looked like they belonged in a spy film. "This is a Tier 1 client," Davies had hissed at the assembled staff, his face tight with anxiety. Mr. Julian Thorne. His investment firm, Thorne Capital, could buy this entire city block and turn it into a private garden if he felt like it. There will be no errors, no mistakes, no humanity. He'd looked directly at Ilara when he'd said that. You will not make eye contact. You will not speak unless a direct question is posed to you. You will move with purpose and silence. Am I making myself clear? The staff had murmured their assent. Ilara had simply nodded, her face already a perfect blank mask. Julian Thorne arrived at 8 o'clock sharp. He wasn't what Ilara had expected. He wasn't flashy or loud. He was in his late 40s, dressed in an impeccably tailored but understated charcoal suit. He moved with a quiet, coiled energy, like a panther. His face was sharp, intelligent, with dark, weary eyes that seemed to see everything. He was of Middle Eastern descent, a fact the tabloids often mentioned, but he was as New York as the steel and glass tower they stood in. He was flanked by his head of security, a man named Marcus, who was the size of a small mountain and moved with an unnerving grace, and a younger female aide with a tablet. They exuded an aura of quiet, absolute competence. 15 minutes later, the second party arrived, Silas Croft. Where Thorne was understated power, Croft was a spectacle. His suit was a vibrant, aggressive blue. His smile was a brilliant white billboard, his watch a heavy chunk of gold. He carried with him the predatory ease of a man who had built a life on charm and other people's money. He was accompanied by a single, older man who seemed to be shrinking into himself. He was a small, bird-like academic, clutching a worn leather briefcase, whom Croft introduced with a grand flourish as my colleague, the eminent Dr. Alistair Finch. The room was set. The pieces were on the board. Ilara's job was simple. Keep the water glasses full, serve the appetizers, and melt into the wallpaper. "Miss Vance," Davies whispered, intercepting her as she prepared the water service. "I will handle Mr. Thorne's table personally. You and Leo will serve only when I signal. Otherwise you stand by the credenza, and you do not move." "Yes, sir." "And Miss Vance?" "Sir, do not stare." Ilara nodded, her expression unreadable, and retreated to her post beside the heavy marble credenza. The doors to the Elysian suite clicked shut, sealing them in. The $150 million negotiation had begun. The suite was designed to be a sensory deprivation tank for the troubles of the outside world. The walls were panelled in dark, polished mahogany. The air was still and cool. A massive, round table dominated the centre of the room, lit by a low-hanging, modern chandelier that cast a warm, intimate glow. It was less a dining room and more a corporate throne room. For the first hour, the conversation was a low murmur of finance and logistics. Ilara and Leo were summoned once to serve the first course, a minimalist arrangement of seared tuna and microgreens. Ilara moved in her practiced silent ballet, placing the dish before Silas Croft, who didn't even glance up. "The chain of custody is unbroken, as you can see," Croft was saying, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "It was held in a private family collection in Istanbul for 3 centuries, then acquired by a German industrialist in the 1920s. It disappeared during the war, of course. We only recently recovered it from a vault in Zurich. A true ghost." "A ghost with a very high price," Thorne noted. His English was perfect, a product of Exeter and Yale, but there was a faint, musical cadence to his words that hinted at another language spoken at home. He tasted the tuna, his expression unreadable. "The most beautiful ghosts always are," Croft countered with a practiced chuckle. "But this, Julian, this is not merely an acquisition. This is a repatriation, a piece of your own heritage, the Corsair's chart." Ilara retreated to her wall. From her vantage point, she could observe them all. Thorne was guarded, a master of the poker face, listening far more than he spoke. His aide took quiet notes. Marcus, his security chief, stood near the door, unmoving, his gaze methodically sweeping the room, lingering on Croft, then on the nervous Dr. Finch. The academic was a mess. He hadn't touched his food. He kept wiping his damp palms on his tweed trousers. He looked less like an eminent colleague and more like a man at his own parole hearing. "Dr. Finch," Thorne said suddenly, his voice cutting through Croft's monologue. The small man jumped as if struck. "You are the expert here. You have personally authenticated this piece." "Ah, yes. Yes, Mr. Thorne. It is unequivocally genuine," Finch stammered, his voice thin and reedy. "The vellum is correct for the period. The inks are consistent. The craftsmanship is simply magnificent." He sounded like a student who had memorized his lines but had forgotten their meaning. Croft placed a heavy hand on Finch's shoulder, a gesture that was half encouragement, half threat. "Alistair is being modest. He's the foremost authority on Ottoman-era cartography. His word is gospel in the auction houses. He was, quite frankly, rendered speechless by the discovery." Ilara felt a familiar, bitter pang. Ottoman-era cartography. That was her field. That was the subject of her unfinished dissertation. She had spent 3 years of her life hunched over manuscripts, analyzing the evolution of Portolan charts, tracing the secret symbols used by Barbary corsairs. She knew the work of Piri Reis, of Ali Makar Reis, of Saidi Ali Reis, as if they were old friends. She knew the experts, too. She had read their papers, cited their books, and she had never, not once, heard of a Dr. Alistair Finch. She pushed the thought away. It was none of her business. Her business was the water glasses, which were now half empty. She moved with silent efficiency, her silver pitcher glinting in the low light, refilling the glasses, her movements a study in practiced invisibility. The conversation continued, a masterful performance by Croft. He wasn't just selling a map, he was selling a legend. He spoke of the golden age of Ottoman exploration, of secret trade routes to the New World, of a map so valuable it could have changed the course of history. "It is a symbol, Julian," Croft declared, his voice resonating with passion. "A symbol of your family's journey, from the old world to the new. It is your history, made tangible." Thorne remained impassive, but Elara saw a flicker of something in his eyes. The weariness was gone, replaced by the keen, focused intensity of a collector on the verge of acquiring a holy grail. This wasn't just business for him. Croft had found his weakness. It was personal. "You have it with you," Thorne stated. It was not a question. Croft's brilliant smile returned. "Of course. I would not describe the majesty of the sun to a man and then deny him its warmth." He nodded to a corner of the room where two of his own security men stood beside a large, matte black, reinforced titanium case. They had been so still, Elara had almost forgotten they were there. "Gentlemen," Croft said, "if you would." Davies, who had been hovering anxiously by the door, scurried forward. "Miss Vance, Leo, clear the table. Now." Elara and Leo moved in tandem, sweeping away the appetizer plates. As Elara reached for Dr. Finch's untouched dish, he flinched, his eyes wide with a brief, naked terror. "My apologies, sir," Elara murmured, keeping her own eyes downcast. "Just be careful with it," he whispered, his voice so low it was almost a thought. She didn't know if he meant the plate or the map. She nodded and retreated. The heavy case was brought to the table. It looked less like an art container and more like a nuclear launch module. The atmosphere in the room grew thick with anticipation. "Mr. Thorne," Croft said, his voice dropping to a dramatic hush, "may I present the Corsair's chart?" He undid the latches with a series of loud, satisfying clicks. The case hissed as the vacuum seal broke. With the flourish of a master showman, Croft lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of custom-molded black velvet, lay the map. Even from her station, 15 feet away, Elara felt a jolt. It was beautiful. It was roughly 2 feet by 3, on a piece of vellum the color of old ivory, its edges frayed by the centuries. The coastlines of the Mediterranean, West Africa, and the Americas were drawn with exquisite, painstaking detail. The seas were alive with illustrations of fantastical beasts and majestic sailing ships. The lettering was a delicate, flowing Arabic script, gilded with what looked like real gold leaf. It wasn't just a map. It was a masterpiece of Renaissance art. "My God," Thorne breathed, leaning forward. His mask of corporate indifference had shattered. This was the collector, the historian, the man connected to a legend. He was captivated. "Crafted in 1513, Croft recited, his voice a low thrum of reverence. "A personal commission, the Admiral's most guarded secret. It shows routes and land masses unknown to Europeans for another century. It is, without exaggeration, the single most important cartographical discovery of the modern era." He gestured to Dr. Finch. "Alistair, the dedication, if you please." Dr. Finch, now sweating profusely under the focused gallery lights, fumbled with a pair of spectacles. He leaned over the map, his finger trembling as it traced the gilded script in the corner. "Ah, yes, the cartouche," he said, clearing his throat. It is as Mr. Croft stated. It reads, Li Sultan al-Bahar, al-Ghazi. For the Sultan of the Sea, the Conqueror, Croft beamed. A direct link, irrefutable. Thorne nodded slowly, his eyes drinking in the artifact. It is magnificent. And the price reflects its singularity, Croft said, sliding a leather-bound portfolio across the table. The full authentication report from Dr. Finch is inside, along with the independent appraisal, $150 million. The number, obscene and audacious, hung in the silent room. Thorne didn't even blink. He opened the portfolio and began to read. It was then that Davies signaled for the main wine service. It was a bottle of Screaming Eagle Cabernet Sauvignon, a vintage that cost more than Ilara's annual tuition had. Her hands, usually rock steady, felt a faint tremor as she lifted the heavy decanter and the fragile, paper-thin glasses onto her silver tray. She approached the table, her path taking her directly past the map, which still lay in its open case. She poured for Thorne first, her movements economical and fluid, then for his aide, then for Silas Croft, who gave her a conspiratorial wink. The nectar of the gods, eh? Ilara ignored him, her face a blank slate of professionalism. She moved to pour for Dr. Finch. The academic was staring at the map, his brow deeply furrowed. As Ilara poured his wine, her vantage point shifted. She was no longer seeing the map from a distance. She was directly above it, the light from the chandelier illuminating every crackle in the vellum, every stroke of the pen. And her eyes trained for years to see the invisible, to spot the anachronism in a single brushstroke, to recognize the subtle tells of a forgery, saw it. It wasn't one thing. It was a cascade of small, screaming impossibilities. Thorne and Croft were now discussing the payment terms, the $20 million initial deposit, the logistics of transport to his private vault in Geneva. Their voices became a distant hum in Ilara's ears. Her focus narrowed until the only thing in the world was the map on the table. She stood frozen, the heavy decanter in her hand. "Miss Vance." It was Davies's voice, a sharp hiss from the doorway. Ilara didn't move. Her gaze was locked on the script, the beautiful, flowing script that Croft had so confidently translated. But Ilara wasn't just looking at the gilded dedication. She was reading the smaller notations, the labels for ports and cities. And they were wrong. The script itself was a beautiful imitation of 16th century Naskh, but the letter forms were too perfect, too uniform. A true 16th century scribe, even a master, would have subtle variations, the human touch. This looked like it had been rendered by a machine or a master calligrapher with a modern sensibility. Then she saw the coastline, a small bay on the coast of what would become Brazil. It was depicted with a distinctive, hooked shape, a shape that wasn't accurately charted until Captain Cook's voyages more than 200 years later. It was a tiny detail, one that only a specialist would ever notice, an impossible, catastrophic error. And then, the final, damning piece. Tucked away in a decorative border, almost invisible to the naked eye, was a tiny watermark embedded in the vellum itself. It wasn't an Ottoman crescent or a Venetian guild mark. Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. She knew that mark. She had seen it before, magnified 1,000 times in a forensic report. It was a stylized phoenix, its wings unfurled, the signature of the most brilliant, elusive art forger of the last 50 years. A ghost known only as the Maestro. The man who had ruined her grandfather. Her grandfather, Arthur Vance, had been a respected, if not famous, academic and historical consultant. He had staked his entire reputation and life savings on authenticating a newly discovered manuscript, a supposed lost gospel. It had been his crowning achievement. But it had been a fake, a masterpiece of deception created by the Maestro. The scandal, the lawsuits, the public humiliation had shattered him. It was the reason Ilara was here, in this uniform, instead of in a university archive. This wasn't just a forgery. This was his forgery. "The wire transfer for the $20 million deposit is ready for your authorization, sir," Thorne's aide said, holding up the secure tablet. Thorne picked up the stylus. His eyes were still on the map, filled with a sense of wonder and historical reverence. "It's a masterpiece," he murmured. "It truly is." Croft leaned back in his chair, the very picture of triumph. They were about to transfer $20 million and commit to $130 million more for a piece of gilded trash. A piece of trash made by the very phantom who had destroyed her family. "Miss Vance, move away from the table. Now." Davies's voice was sharp with rising panic. Ilara's hand was shaking. The decanter rattled against the tray. Her mind was a battlefield. "Say nothing. It's not your problem. You'll be fired. You'll be blacklisted. You'll lose the house. Say nothing." Thorne's thumb hovered over the confirm button on the screen. Ilara set the decanter down on the credenza. The crystal hit the marble with a sharp, definitive clink that was as loud as a gunshot in the silent room. Every head turned. The invisible waitress had just made a sound. The silence that followed the clink of the decanter was profound and absolute. Silas Croft's triumphant smile faltered, twitching at the edges. Mr. Davies looked as if he was personally witnessing the apocalypse. His face went from its usual pale pink to a mottled, terrifying shade of crimson. Julian Thorne's security chief, Marcus, shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, his hand drifting inside his jacket. Even Julian Thorne, a man who commanded boardrooms and moved global markets, raised a single curious eyebrow. He looked at Ilara, not with the immediate annoyance of a man of his stature, but with a cool, analytical curiosity. "Miss Vance," Davies sputtered, rushing forward as if to physically shield the guests from her presence. "My deepest apologies, Mr. Thorne, gentlemen. The girl is new. She is clumsy." "I am not clumsy, Mr. Davies," Ilara said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried a strange new weight. It sliced through the thick, expensive air of the room. This was it. The leap off the cliff. The end of her job. The end of her financial stability. The end of her invisibility. She could feel the adrenaline singing in her veins, a hot, sharp current. But it wasn't just fear. It was a cold, righteous fury that had been dormant for a decade. "Excuse me?" Croft said. The honeyed charm was gone from his voice, replaced by a blade of pure steel. "I believe we are in the middle of a rather significant private transaction." "You are," Ilara agreed, turning to face him directly. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice, by some miracle, was steady. "You're in the middle of a $150 million fraud." She then did the unthinkable. She turned her back on Silas Croft, a calculated and devastating insult, and looked directly at Julian Thorne. She had been explicitly forbidden from making eye contact. She did it anyway. "Mr. Thorne," she said. "Ilara!" Davies practically shrieked, grabbing her arm. "Do not touch her," Thorne said. His voice was soft, almost gentle, but it had the chilling authority of a monarch. Davies froze, his hand dropping from her arm as if it had been scorched. Thorne's gaze was intense, analytical. He was no longer looking at a waitress. He was looking at an anomaly, a variable he hadn't accounted for. "You have something you wish to say, Miss Vance?" "Yes, sir, I do," Ilara said. "You are a collector, a man who values history. You are being sold a beautifully crafted lie." The room erupted. "What is the meaning of this?" Croft roared, surging to his feet so fast his chair screeched against the polished floor. "This is an outrage, an accusation by a servant, security." Marcus didn't move. His eyes were on his boss. Thorne held up a hand, a simple gesture that instantly commanded silence. He looked at Ilara. That is a very strong accusation, Miss Vance. You should choose your next words with extreme care. I will, Elara said. She walked towards the table, her cheap, regulation black shoes making no sound on the plush carpet. She stood before the magnificent map. Mr. Croft, she began, her voice taking on an academic clarity she hadn't used in years. Earlier this evening, you translated the inscription in this cartouche. She pointed to the gilded script. You said it read, Li Sultan al-Bahar al-Ghazi. For the Sultan of the Sea, the Conqueror. And it does, Croft snapped. Our expert authenticated it. No, he didn't, Elara said calmly. He read a line he had memorized. This script, she leaned closer, is not a dedication. It's not even 16th century Ottoman Turkish. It's a 19th century Levantine Arabic merchant's blessing, a very common one. It begins, Bi'izm Allah, Majreha wa Mursaha. In the name of God, be its course and its anchorage. It's a phrase used to bless a ship or a new venture. It has absolutely no place on the personal map of a 16th century admiral. Croft's face was a canvas of shock and fury. He shot a look of pure venom at Dr. Finch. She's mistaken, Finch stammered, his eyes darting around like a cornered animal. The lighting, she's just a waitress, Elara finished for him. I know, but I am a waitress whose unfinished doctoral dissertation was on anachronisms in Renaissance-era Portolan charts. And that brings me to the second problem. She pointed to a section of the South American coastline. This inlet here, the Bay of All Saints in Brazil, it's depicted with remarkable accuracy, an accuracy that wasn't achieved until the late 18th century, following the expeditions of Captain Cook. It is a cartographical impossibility for a map dated 1513. Thorne leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, following her finger. He was no longer looking at a piece of art. He was looking at a puzzle. This is absurd, Croft blustered. Mr. Thorne, are you truly going to listen to this fantasy from a disgruntled employee over the sworn testimony of an accredited expert? Thorne ignored him. He was staring at the map, then at Elara. A new, dangerous light was dawning in his eyes. He was re-evaluating everything, every word that had been spoken that night. You mentioned accredited expert, Elara said, turning her cool gaze on Dr. Finch. Dr. Alistair Finch, I've never heard of you, but I have heard of your last position. At the British Museum's Manuscript Department. You were quietly dismissed in 2018, weren't you, Doctor? For authenticating a series of Anglo-Saxon charters that were later proven to be brilliant 19th century forgeries. Dr. Finch looked as though Elara had physically struck him. He sank back into his chair, a low moan escaping his lips. His face was slick with sweat. That was a professional disagreement. This, Elara said, her voice ringing with the conviction of absolute certainty, gesturing to the map, is not a disagreement. This is a felony. The room was as silent as a tomb. All pretense had been stripped away. Croft was no longer a charming art dealer. He was a trapped predator. Thorne was no longer a client. He was a judge. And the final most damning proof, Elara said, her voice filled with a cold, personal fury that had been building for 10 years, is this. She looked at Thorne's aide. May I see your tablet for a moment? The young woman looked at her boss, who gave a curt, single nod. The tablet was handed to Elara. Her fingers, which had been trembling moments before, were now steady as a surgeon's. They flew across the screen, pulling up a browser, typing in the URL of a deep archive academic server from memory. I don't need a microscope, she said, her voice dropping. I know this mark by heart. She turned the tablet around. On the screen was a high-resolution, magnified image from the forensic report on her grandfather's case. It showed a close-up of a manuscript's vellum, and embedded within the fibers was a tiny, almost imperceptible watermark, a stylized phoenix. "This is the signature of a master forger known only as the Maestro," Ilara said, "the man responsible for the fake Anglo-Saxon charters Dr. Finch authenticated, the man whose work destroyed my grandfather, a historian named Arthur Vance. He's a ghost, but he's an arrogant ghost. He signs his work." She then pointed to a seemingly blank spot on the Corsair's chart, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. "If you use a polarized light source, which I'm sure Mr. Thorne's security team has, you will find it right there." Thorne didn't need the light. He leaned in, his sharp eyes scrutinizing the spot. Marcus, his security chief, produced a small, powerful penlight from his pocket and angled the beam across the surface of the vellum. There it was. Faint, almost invisible, but undeniably present. The phoenix. The artifice was shattered. The $150 million masterpiece was a worthless, modern fake. Silas Croft's face was a mask of pure, murderous rage. He looked at Ilara, and the violence in his eyes was so palpable she took an involuntary step back. "You," he seethed, his voice a low, venomous hiss. "You have no idea what you have just done. You just signed your own death warrant." Before anyone could react, Croft lunged. But he wasn't lunging for Ilara. He was lunging for the map. He grabbed the priceless forgery, his intention clear: to rip it to shreds, to destroy the evidence. He never had the chance. Marcus moved with a speed that defied his size. He crossed the room in a single, fluid stride. He didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for Croft's wrist. There was a sharp, sickening snap of bone. Croft screamed, a high, piercing sound of agony that was abruptly cut off as Marcus's other hand delivered a precise, disabling chop to the side of his neck. Croft collapsed like a marionette whose strings had been cut. The map fluttered harmlessly onto the thick carpet. Dr. Finch let out a terrified sob and buried his face in his hands. By the door, Mr. Davies's eyes rolled back in his head, and he fainted, slumping to the floor in a boneless heap. Ilara stood, breathing heavily, her heart pounding so hard it ached in her chest. Julian Thorne calmly straightened the cuff of his shirt. He looked down at the gasping Silas Croft, then at the unconscious Davies, then at the weeping Dr. Finch. Finally, his gaze came to rest on Ilara. A long, unreadable moment passed. Then, to her utter astonishment, he turned his head slightly and spoke to her, not in English, but in perfect, formal Arabic. "Fi ra'yik al-khabir, hal hada haqiqi am muzayaf?" In your expert opinion, is this real or is it fake? Ilara didn't hesitate. She replied in the same flawless, academic Arabic, her voice clear and strong. "Hada muzayaf, bila shak." This is a fake, without a doubt. This is a fake. Thorne repeated her words in English, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. He looked at the map on the floor, then back at her. "I believe you." The words, "This is a fake," hung in the air, a final, irrevocable verdict. The power dynamic in the room had been completely inverted. Thorne's aide was on her phone, speaking in low, rapid tones. It was clear she wasn't calling the police. She was calling in a different kind of authority. The silence that descended after the door clicked shut was heavier than the one that had preceded it. Before, it had been a silence of tension, of anticipation. This was the silence of aftermath, thick with the dust of shattered certainties. The air, once scented with orchids and old leather, now seemed to smell of nothing but cold adrenaline and the metallic tang of fear. The magnificent Elysian suite, designed to be a bastion of untouchable wealth, had become a crime scene. An overturned chair lay on its side, like a casualty of war. The fraudulent map, a masterpiece of deceit, was a splash of old ivory and gold against the deep crimson of the carpet. Ilara stood by the marble credenza, her hand still gripping its cold edge. The tremors had begun in earnest now, a deep, seismic shudder that started in her knees and worked its way up her spine. The adrenaline, that miraculous, clarifying fire, was gone, leaving behind only the ash of exhaustion and a terrifying, vertiginous sense of unreality. She felt as if she were floating a few inches above the floor, watching a stranger in a waitress uniform who had just gambled with her life. Julian Thorne had not moved. He stood near the center of the room, a figure of absolute stillness amidst the chaos she had unleashed. He looked at the bound and weeping Dr. Finch being led away by one of the plain-clothes agents, his expression unreadable. He glanced at the spot where Silas Croft had collapsed, a flicker of profound distaste crossing his features. Finally, his gaze, dark and penetrating, came to rest on her. It was not a hostile gaze, nor was it entirely benign. It was the look of a physicist studying a particle that had inexplicably defied the known laws of the universe. "Arthur Vance," he said again, his voice a low murmur that seemed to absorb the room's lingering echoes. "I knew of him. Not personally, but I followed the Vancroft Gospel affair. I read the papers, his and those of his detractors." He began to walk slowly towards the vast floor-to-ceiling window, his footsteps swallowed by the carpet. They called him a fool, a man blinded by ambition, but I read his initial authentication. It was brilliant, meticulous. He wasn't a fool. He was a scholar who encountered an artist of equal, if malevolent, genius. He reached the window and stood for a long moment, looking down at the city, a glittering, indifferent galaxy laid out 1,000 feet below. "There is a particular kind of cruelty in what the maestro does," Thorne continued, his back to her. "It is not simple theft. It is a form of historical vandalism. He doesn't just steal money. He poisons the well of the past. He creates lies so beautiful they eclipse the truth. He makes men like your grandfather doubt their own minds." Ilara found her voice, though it was thin and reedy, a ghost of its former self. "He erases people," she whispered. "My grandfather. He didn't die from the scandal. He died from the doubt. He spent the last years of his life re-examining every piece of work he'd ever done, searching for other mistakes, other deceptions. He lost faith in his own knowledge, in himself." "Yes," Thorne said, a world of understanding in that single word. He turned from the window, and the city lights framed him in silhouette. "That is the true nature of his crime, and that is why he must be found." He walked back towards her, stopping a few feet away. The analytical curiosity was still in his eyes, but it was now tempered with something else, a shared and somber understanding. "You have a remarkable mind, Miss Vance, and a memory that is, frankly, terrifying. The detail about Dr. Finch's dismissal from the British Museum, that was not common knowledge." "I read the footnotes," she said simply. "When you're trying to get a grant, you research the people who will be reviewing your application. You learn who to trust and who not to. Finch's name was flagged, quietly, in certain circles. The footnotes," he repeated, a slow, wry smile touching his lips for the first time. It was not a smile of amusement, but of recognition. "The world is run by people who read the footnotes, and it is undone by those who do not." He gestured to the door. "My car is waiting downstairs. You should not be here when the official authorities arrive. The narrative will be simplified for their benefit. A deal gone wrong. An internal dispute. It is better for you not to be involved in that part of the story." Ilara's mind, still reeling, snagged on a practical, terrifying thought. "My job, Mr. Davies." "Mr. Davies and his catastrophic failure to protect his client are no longer your concern," Thorne said, his tone turning to ice. "Ethelgards will be compensated for their inconvenience. As for your employment, consider it terminated. Not by Mr. Davies, but by circumstance. You cannot return to a life of calculated invisibility after tonight. You have made yourself seen." The finality of it hit her like a physical blow. She had no job. She had a mortgage. She had just made a mortal enemy of a powerful criminal network. Croft's final, venomous threat echoed in her ears. "You'll be looking over your shoulder for the rest of your life." Thorne seemed to read the fear on her face. "You will be safe," he stated, not as a reassurance but as a fact. "Marcus will see you home. A security detail will be arranged. Discreetly." He was offering protection. He was solving her problems. And yet, Ilara felt a strange sense of deflation. It was all so transactional. She had saved him from a historic fraud, and he was providing a severance package of safety and silence. She had spoken the truth, and her reward was to be erased once more, bundled away into a protected, anonymous life. She would be safe, but she would still be a waitress without a job, a scholar without a future. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," she said, the formal words tasting like ash in her mouth. He tilted his head, his perception once again unnervingly acute. "That is the response of an employee, Miss Vance. I had hoped for the response of a scholar." He paused. "I am not dismissing you. I am inviting you. Come." Without waiting for a reply, he turned and walked out of the Elysian suite. After a moment of stunned hesitation, Ilara followed. The journey down in the private elevator was silent. Ilara was hyper-aware of everything: the whisper of the elevator's descent, the cool, brushed steel of the walls, the immense, quiet presence of Julian Thorne beside her. He was no longer looking at her, his gaze fixed on the descending floor numbers, his mind clearly already processing the night's events, calculating his next moves on a chessboard she couldn't begin to imagine. They emerged not in the grand lobby, but in a private, subterranean garage, a cavern of polished concrete and gleaming, impossibly expensive cars. A black, armored sedan glided to a silent stop before them. Marcus was already in the driver's seat. He opened the rear door for her, and she slid onto the cool, buttery leather. Thorne got in the other side. The door closed with a heavy, satisfying thud, sealing them in a cocoon of absolute silence and the faint, clean scent of conditioned air. As the car pulled out into the neon-streaked arteries of the city, Ilara watched the familiar world slide past the tinted window, transformed into something alien and distant. It was her city, but it no longer felt like her world. "The first time the maestro crossed my family's path," Thorne said, his voice quiet in the hushed interior of the car, "was 30 years ago. My father was a collector, but of a different sort. He collected not maps, but manuscripts, specifically early Islamic scientific and philosophical texts. It was his passion. His connection to a heritage he felt was slipping away. He stared out the window, but Ilara knew he wasn't seeing the city. He was seeing the past. A manuscript surfaced, a supposedly lost section of Al-Kindi's work on cryptography. It was a holy grail. My father pursued it, staked a significant portion of his fortune and his reputation on acquiring it for a museum in Beirut. He believed he was repatriating a piece of our shared intellectual history. Thorne's voice was flat, devoid of emotion, which only amplified the pain beneath the surface. It was, of course, a forgery. A perfect, brilliant, soul-destroying forgery. The humiliation was public. The financial loss was severe. But worse, like your grandfather, it broke his confidence. He never collected again. He turned to look at her then, and in his eyes she saw not the billionaire titan of industry, but the son of a wounded man. So you see, Miss Vanto, when I say I understand, I am not offering a platitude. I have lived in the shadow of this ghost my entire adult life. I have been hunting him, quietly, with the vast resources at my disposal, for 15 years. And in all that time, I have never been as close to him as I was tonight, in that room with you. The transactional nature of his earlier offer dissolved. This wasn't a reward, it wasn't a job, it was a convergence. 2 separate paths, 2 different generations, both scarred by the same phantom, had just intersected in a hotel suite 1,000 feet in the sky. What you did tonight, he continued, his voice low and intense, was not merely about saving me money. You provided a key. Croft is a blunt instrument, but he will lead to other, sharper instruments. Finch, the compromised academic, is a type the maestro must use regularly. And the map itself is a treasure trove. His techniques, his materials, his tells. He made a mistake tonight. He chose a story, my story, that was too personal, and he sold it to me in a room with the one person in 10 million who could see the lie for what it was. Hubris. The car turned off the main avenue, gliding down a quiet, tree-lined street on the Upper East Side. Ilara had assumed they were taking her home to her small house in Queens, a journey that would take at least 45 minutes. This was not the way to Queens. "Where are we going?" she asked, a fresh tremor of uncertainty running through her. "I am not offering you a job, Miss Vance," Thorne said, directly answering her unspoken question. "Jobs are for people who want security. I am offering you something far more dangerous. I am offering you a war. My foundation has the resources, the technology, the legal power, but we lack the specific, esoteric, and deeply personal expertise that you possess. We have the arsenal. We need the strategist, the hunter." The car slowed, pulling into a private driveway before a magnificent, ivy-covered brownstone, a relic of old New York nestled amongst the glass towers. "I am not asking you to be an employee in a department," he said, as Marcus opened his door. "I am asking you to build the department around yourself, to create a new field, a fusion of historical scholarship and forensic science, dedicated to one purpose, preserving the integrity of the historical record, to hunt forgeries, to recover stolen artifacts, and to find the man who has haunted both our families." He got out of the car and waited. Marcus opened her door. Ilara's mind was a maelstrom of thoughts. The salary he had mentioned in the restaurant, a number that could rewrite her life, was now almost an insult, a crude and insufficient way to measure what he was truly offering. He was offering her a purpose. He was offering her vengeance. He was offering her the chance to restore her grandfather's name, not by clearing it, but by finishing his work. She stepped out of the car into the cool night air. The street was silent, impossibly peaceful. Thorne led her up the stone steps and unlocked a heavy, dark wood door. He didn't take her into a foyer or a living room. He led her down a short hallway and opened another door, revealing a library that stole her breath away. It was 2 stories high, walled from floor to ceiling with dark, polished wood shelves crammed with books. A spiral staircase of wrought iron curled up to a second-level gallery. In the center of the room, on climate-controlled pedestals and under museum-quality lighting, were not just books, but artifacts. A celestial globe of brass and silver, a medieval astrolabe, and under a sheet of protective glass, a vellum manuscript that glowed with the soft light of centuries. "This," Thorne said, his voice filled with a quiet reverence that had been absent all night, "is what is real. This is what we protect." He walked over to a heavy oak table and, using a key, unlocked a flat, wide drawer. He reached inside and carefully lifted out a slim, leather-bound portfolio. He placed it on the table and opened it. Inside lay a single, unbound page. It was a portolan chart, smaller than the forgery, but infinitely more beautiful in its authenticity. It depicted the Aegean Sea, the ink faded but clear, the coastlines drawn with the confident, slightly imperfect hand of a man who had sailed them. "Genoese school," Ilara breathed, stepping forward without thinking, her scholarly instincts overriding everything else. "Late 14th century. The vellum preparation, the specific pigment in the wind roses. It's the work of the Pizzigano brothers." Thorne looked at her, and his smile was genuine now, a shared moment of pure, academic passion. "Visconte Pizzigano," he confirmed, one of the few known surviving examples of his solo work. He watched her as she gazed at the chart, her eyes tracing the familiar lines, her mind alive with a fire she thought had been extinguished years ago. The weariness, the fear, the shock. It all fell away, replaced by the profound, centering peace of being in the presence of the truth. "Croft's threat was not idle," Thorne said, his voice serious again. "This path will not be safe. The maestro has remained a ghost for so long because he is ruthless in protecting his anonymity. To hunt him is to make yourself a target." Ilara didn't look up from the map. Her fingers hovered over the ancient vellum, not daring to touch it, but feeling its history, its reality, radiating from it like a gentle heat. This was her world. This was the world that had been stolen from her, the world she had been forced to observe from behind the glass of a waitress's invisible life. "He already made me a target 10 years ago," she said, her voice quiet but imbued with a new, unshakable strength. "He just didn't know my name." She finally looked up, meeting his gaze across the priceless artifact. The chasm between them, of wealth, of power, of circumstance, had vanished. They were no longer a billionaire and a waitress. They were two scholars, two hunters, two survivors of the same invisible war, standing at the threshold of a new campaign. "The salary you mentioned is more than generous," she said. "But it's not why I will accept. The resources, the laboratory, they are tools. The real reason is this." She gestured around the library, at the silent, sleeping history that surrounded them. "The truth has a weight. The lies are weightless. They float away, but they poison the air. Someone has to ground them." She looked at her own hands. They were calloused from carrying trays, the nails clipped short. They were the hands of a servant. But they were also the hands that knew the feel of real history, the hands that had pointed out the lie. They would be the hands that would now fight for it. "So, yes, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice clear and resonant in the hallowed silence of the library. "I accept your offer. Not the job, the war." A look of profound, solemn satisfaction settled on Julian Thorne's face. He extended his hand, not as a benefactor to his new employee, but as an equal, an ally. "Then Ilara Vance," he said, as her hand met his. "We begin."